Hello all, and welcome to the second and final part of my two-part series where let's read a brief illustrated guide to understanding Islam, in which I give a skeptical lay reading of this booklet. Before I get into where we're at, I just want to talk about the thing I left off in the previous video. So the previous video, the last section I talked about was one where a variety of scientists gave their opinion that the scientific miracles that are claimed in the Quran, to their thinking, was absolute proof of the Quran's divine authorship. And at the time I sort of said that basically these scientists must be idiots if that was an accurate representation of their reasoning. And I stand by that. But I did want to say a couple of other remarks about this. Some would say that this is just an appeal to authority and that's a logical fallacy. And while that is strictly the case, appeals to authority actually do have value. When we're talking about the logical necessity of a conclusion, i.e. whether something must be true, then appeals to authority are fallacious. There's no value in them. Simply because scientist X says that, Y must be true, has no real bearing on whether or not it is. However, when we're talking about probabilities, whether something is likely to be true or not, then authorities do have a big role in this. Most of us are not experts on a lot of things, and the things that we're not experts on and that we don't have the time or inclination to become experts in, we do actually have to rely on authorities or experts in those fields to tell us what is most likely to be true. And so the reasoning goes simply that if expert A says that B is true, then that makes it more likely that B would be true than if expert A hadn't said that. Now, where does that leave us? So, that said, it might seem that the fact that the scientists have come out and said that, they were impressed by what's in the Quran, would suggest that that is more likely to be true. The thing is, though, this would be far more compelling if instead of having half a dozen individual scientists claiming this, if this book contained endorsements from various professional bodies. That is, if there was a consensus of embryologists that the embryology in the Quran is staggeringly scientifically sort of amazing, that would be telling. The fact that they can find one embryologist or two embryologists to say that actually goes against them. So when we think about topics such as evolution, when you look at the overwhelming consensus of 99.9% of biologists is that evolution is absolutely true. The consensus of embryologists, I would assume, is that the Quran does not have anything particularly interesting to say on the topic of embryology. That said, there's always going to be one or two, and they've managed to find them to get them to speak in this book. So, I'm willing to stand corrected on this, but as far as I can tell, none of the large professional bodies for any of the relevant scientific disciplines have any position that the Quran has particularly interesting scientific knowledge. And so I just sort of wanted to put that one in there because I kind of missed that point last time. Okay, in this video, I want to finish off chapter 1 of this book. And remember, chapter 1 is all about the evidence for believing in the Quran. And so, by the end of this video, we will have finished all of chapter 1, we will have had the evidence presented to us, and we'll be in a position to, I guess, make a solid judgment over whether this book presents compelling evidence. Okay, so the rest of chapter 1 consists of a number of sections. That is, there's, let me see. Yeah, there are 6 more sections in this, but they're most of them are only 1 or 2 pages, so we'll get through them all. So, Section 2, the great challenge to produce one chapter like the chapters of the Holy Quran. Essentially, let's read from the Quran here. And if you are in doubt about what we have revealed, the Quran, to our worshipper, Muhammad, then produce a chapter like it and call your witnesses, supporters and helpers, besides God if you are truthful. And if you do not do it, and you can never do it, then fear the fire, hell, whose fuel is men and stones. It has been prepared for disbelievers. And give good news, O Muhammad, to those who believe and do good deeds, that for them are gardens, paradise, in which rivers flow. Quran, chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. God, that you should produce yourself a chapter like it. And that if you can produce something that is as good as the Quran, then that would disprove that it's of divine origin. Now, in the book it goes on to say that essentially the criteria by which we should judge the Quran as its divinity, and hence any challenge to that, is in its beauty, eloquence, splendour, wise legislation, true information, true prophecy, and other perfect attributes. And it also points out that the shortest chapter in the Quran is only 10 words. In Arabic it's about 20 odd in English. Not that that's the Quran. So first off, I want to say that this is actually not a bad challenge. If God were to author a book, we could, I guess, expect it to be perfect in every respect and significantly and qualitatively better than any other book that man has produced. Now, I've read several chapters from the translation of the Quran excerpts from in the past video, and I've read one just then, and none of them stand out to me as being particularly useful. Or particularly different from anything that I've seen in other holy books, or even human writings. Now, there's always a cop-out here for the Muslim to say, well, you didn't actually read the Quran. The Quran is in Arabic, and it's only if you understand the Arabic in its full glory that you'll be able to understand the subtleties and the nuances of the Quran and appreciate how fantastic it is. Essentially what this is, that one response possible is that no matter what you produce, the Muslim is always going to be able to say, well, actually you didn't understand how fantastic the Quran is, you haven't actually read the Quran in its original Arabic, etc, etc, etc. But on a surface reading of the translation that I have, there's nothing particularly fantastic. I've even read a few different versions online, a few different translations, and none of them come across as fantastic. And what I did want to do is I actually think the Quran fails on this test quite significantly, and I would compare it to Shakespeare. Now, why Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare was an absolute genius. If you look up Shakespeare in quotations, you will find quote after quote after quote that has entered our common language and is still in common usage. Shakespeare coined the phrase to coin a phrase. He actually came up with that, and he came up with so much of what we use. He was a true genius, a literary genius. Now, nobody would claim that he is God, or that his words were the words of God, and yet I wholeheartedly believe that the stuff that he wrote, a lot of the stuff he wrote, was far, far better than anything I've read in the Quran.
Alas, poor Yorick.
I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times. And now, how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now? Your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning. Quite chapfallen. Now, get you to my lady's chamber and tell her.
This is one of my favourite. I'm sure you have other favourites. The point is that a lot of what Shakespeare wrote is far better than the stuff that I've read of the Quran. And so I don't really think this is a serious challenge, even if you were to take it seriously. Section 3. Biblical prophecies on the advent of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. Now, in this section, what is claimed is that the Hebrew Bible, what the Christians know as the Old Testament, contains many prophecies about coming prophets and the coming of the Messiah in the Jewish religion, and that the claim is that Muhammad fulfills these prophecies. So let's have a reading from Deuteronomy. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from my brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 18 to 19. Now in this section, this is God speaking to the people of Israel, and he's saying that he will produce this other prophet. Now, what the book seems to suggest is that, that three things, that he's talking about Moses here, that God is talking about Moses, that the prophet who is supposed to come will be similar to Moses, that he will come from it will be from your brothers, and that he will speak the word of God. Now, the book goes on then to claim that Muhammad is much more a prophet like Moses than Jesus ever was. And so it goes into a long discussion about how Muhammad and Moses have similarities that Jesus and Moses don't have. Because of course the Christians claim that Jesus fulfills this prophecy, and the Muslims claim that Muhammad fulfills this prophecy from Deuteronomy. Needless to say, the Jews believe that neither of them fulfills this prophecy, and that we are still waiting the coming of this prophet. They have a quote from John, essentially it's John chapter 1 verses 19 to 21. Basically the Pharisees are questioning John and saying, look, are you claiming to be the Christ? And John says no, and he says, well, are you the prophet Elijah? And he says no, and he says, well, are you the prophet? And he says no. And from this, this book claims that essentially differentiates between Christ, being the Christ, and being the prophet of Deuteronomy. And so therefore these two things are different, and so even if Jesus was accepted as the Christ, he wouldn't be the prophet, and that Muhammad was the prophet. Now, the Christians claim that actually this is the questioning that's being done is by the Pharisees, and that the Pharisees have divided the Christ from the prophet, and incorrectly. And that Christ and the prophet in this sense are actually the same person, and that John is just answering no to both of the questions, that it's a bit redundant. Now, all of this aside, and then it goes on to say that, the book goes on to say that that saying about raising a prophet from my brothers, that the brothers of the Israelites would be the Ishmaelites, and that the Arabs are the descendants of Ishmael, and the Jews are the descendants of are the Israelites. Now, the Christians obviously deny this, and they say that the brothers of the Israelites are the Israelites themselves, that these are their brothers, and it's not necessarily meant to be the brother of the Ishmaelites. The point of this is, none of this is particularly convincing to somebody like myself, and here's why. So the claim is that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, predicts the coming of some prophet. Okay? That book has been in circulation for a long time. And then a new religion comes along, Christianity, and they claim that their person fits this prediction. Another new religion comes along, Islam, and they claim that their prophet fits this description. I wouldn't even be surprised if when Mormonism came along that they claimed that Joseph Smith fits this prediction. If you want your prophet to be taken seriously within the existing tradition, you have to make sure they fit that tradition. It's no surprise that Jesus fits that tradition. In fact, if you look up the Christian websites, they'll give you ample evidence about how Jesus definitely is the prophet that is talked about in Deuteronomy and that has been prophesied in the Old Testament. That is not particularly good evidence for Jesus. That's particularly good evidence that the people who were trying to convince the Jews that Jesus was the Christ knew their Jewish law. This is evidence that the people who wanted to convince the non-Muslims to convert to Islam understood their Jewish law as well, and were careful to make sure that Muhammad fit within the prophecies. It's not exactly a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's hardly a challenge to fulfill a prophecy you already know about. So I don't find that particularly convincing, especially when other traditions will claim that their person is the prophet, and nobody's evidence seems to be much better than anybody else. The other thing is, I don't believe in the Old Testament, so I don't believe you can't use the Hebrew Bible to convince me to believe that your book is infallible, because I don't believe their book's infallible. You'd first have to establish to me that the Hebrew Bible is worth taking seriously, and I don't believe that either. And that's it for this section. Section 4. the verses in the Quran that mention future events which later came to pass. That is, prophecies. Now, it's claimed that there are many verses in the Quran that mention future events that eventually came to pass, but they only present one. So we're going to look into the one that they do present, and let's start with a quote from the Quran. The Romans have been defeated in the nearest land to the Arabian Peninsula, and they, after their defeat, will be victorious within bed 3 to 9 years. Quran, verse 30, chapter 30, verses 2 to 4. The Byzantine, well, the part of the Roman Empire that's called the Byzantine Empire had been badly beaten in the Battle of Antioch in 613 CE by the Persians. So at this point, so they're saying they've been defeated, and Muhammad is, well, I guess it's the word of God, is predicting that after this defeat, within 3 to 9 years, the Romans will defeat the Persians again. So that's 613. 9 years later, in 622, the Romans defeat the Persians in Armenia, and that's the first battle apparently they've won since Antioch, and it's exactly 9 years later. So the question is this prediction particularly impressive? And I would suggest probably not. Now, in the book they want to claim that the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, had been defeated by the Persians, and at that point it would not have been reasonable for anybody to predict that they would win again within 3 to 9 years. This to me seems to suggest a lack of familiarity with the Roman Empire and with warfare across the Middle East. My understanding, which is not great, of history is that there were a lot of warring factions back and forth, and the Roman Empire stood for a long time, and it had stood for a very long time by 613. I mean, by 613, that's 600 years after Christ, and if they were around in Christ's day, I'm pretty sure they were around before Christ's day. So the idea that the Romans would simply not have been able to defeat the Persians when they had already defeated the Persians a number of times before that, the idea they wouldn't have been able to defeat them within 9 years hardly to me seems like a particularly telling prediction. The second thing to be said, that even if this was an incredibly unlikely thing, I wonder if this is simply the sharpshooter fallacy. So we know that people who claim to be psychics will often make a number of different predictions, and we know that people tend to remember the ones that come true, and they don't really remember the ones that didn't come true. And so it's actually in a sort of, if somebody's in the business of making predictions, it's actually in their best interest to make some crazy predictions out there, because when they do come true, they seem staggeringly impressive, and when they don't come true, most people don't actually remember. This particularly fits with the idea because we actually know that parts of the Quran were, I think they call it abrogated, that is taken back during Muhammad's lifetime. So the Quran was revealed to Muhammad throughout his lifetime. He would go to his cave, I think, or he would be visited by the angel Gabriel, who would give him more of the Quran. So it wasn't one big revelation like Joseph Smith was supposed to have received. It came over years. And sometimes later revelations would undo previous revelations. And so if that's true, not being much of a scholar, I would have to ask, well, if he made this prediction, could it possibly have been undone later if it didn't come to pass? Maybe. At which point, the fact that this one stands doesn't say anything about all the other predictions that maybe were undone or you haven't mentioned that didn't come true. I also wonder what would count as a victory. I mean, the true victory of the Romans over the Persians actually came 3 years later after that, 12 years. And so what's considered to be the ultimate victory there came 12 years, which was outside of that time frame. Had it come earlier, I suspect that people would be claiming that it was a fulfilled prophecy. So I kind of feel like they're just grasping on something that would fulfill it. It's not a particularly specific prediction that they would simply be victorious, because you could be victorious in any number of ways. Another aspect of this is that it's widely accepted that part of this chapter of the Quran is actually talking about the Roman religion versus the Persian religion. So the defeat of the Romans, the military defeat of the Romans, was seen somewhat as the Roman religion, which was Christianity at the time, which was seen as by the early Muslims saw Christianity as very much close to their religion because they were monotheistic to some definition, and the Persians were seen as being pagans. And so when the Persians defeated the Romans, this was seen as a proxy defeat for their religion, the religion of Islam. And so there is a theological implication here that some of this, that this passage may have actually been intended as a sort of a spiritual victory, that although the Romans, the monotheistic religion of the Romans, the God of Abraham being defeated, that they would become victorious in some spiritual way in the next 9 years. And so if that's the case, it would be hard to see a way that this prediction couldn't have come true. And the final problem with this is the question of whether it is even a prediction. Now, I've mentioned in my first video how the belief amongst many Muslims is that the Quran that we have today is identical to that which was revealed to Muhammad, despite him being illiterate. Now, I've looked into this further since the last video, and it turns out that we actually do have, unlike Christianity, we do have a written copy of the Quran from, I think, about the 8th century, maybe the 9th century, 8th or 9th century, that is almost identical to what we have nowadays. And so actually, the last sort of 1200 years or so, there has been remarkably little change in the Quran at all. It has been incredibly well kept with very little divergence. The real question is that we know that also that the Quran initially was a oral tradition, and we don't actually, there is very little scholarship by people who aren't Muslims into the accuracy with which the Quran was taken from Muhammad and written down. And there is evidence that there had been some variation in the documents. And as I say, the first written Quran that we have in existence, which is a fantastically good, compared to the situation with the Bible, the Quran situation is completely different. I mean, we have genuinely good copies, like fantastically good copies that are really quite close to. The problem is it's still 150 years after Muhammad, after this prediction was made. So the first written copy we have is 150 years after this prediction. And so it is quite possible that this prediction was not made exactly like this at the time. It could have been like we suspect with parts of the Bible, that the prediction was made after the event. So you have the Romans get defeated, they come back, they fight and are victorious over the Persians, and at that point somebody inserts a prediction saying that that's what would happen, and my goodness, they're always correct. I don't know whether that's a truly great hypothesis, but as a skeptic I would like to see much better non-Muslim research into the Quranic history in order to be confident that these prophecies were actually prophecies. Okay, section 5, miracles performed by the Prophet Muhammad. And here we have, they give two examples, and essentially what they say is that the Prophet Muhammad, he split the moon. So I'm not sure what the whole story is, but essentially he pointed up at the moon and the moon split in the sky and then it reformed. And there's another one where he makes water flow from his fingers so that people can drink, which is actually a nice allusion to the Moses story of Moses splitting the rock and making the water come out, and is probably for that reason. The story is probably of that form for that reason, so that there are echoes of Moses in Muhammad. Now the thing is, this is one of the least convincing things. The Quran says that Muhammad did miracles, therefore Muhammad must have been the prophet of God, therefore what he wrote down must be God's word. And how do we know it's God's word? Well, because it says so in the Quran. This is the same reasoning that Jesus must be the Son of God, because it says so in the Bible. Joseph Smith must have been a prophet of God as well, because it says so in the Book of Mormon. This is hardly evidence at all. I mean, we really have gone from things that might be convincing to things that cannot be convincing. By the same logic, Harry Potter is a wizard because it says so in Harry Potter. Section 6, the simple life of Muhammad. Now, they spend 3 pages on this. I suspect because they have good evidence for this, that Muhammad lived a very simple life. So the idea was that he was a fairly rich and prosperous merchant before he received his first revelation. He then receives a revelation from God. He thinks he's going he thinks he's going to be mocked and stuff. He ignores it. He gets another revelation, I think a year later or so. He then decides that, yep, this is the real deal, and he goes on this. He goes all out as a prophet of God. He receives lots of revelations. He goes out and preaches it, and as a result, he loses a lot of his wealth. He gets ostracized by the society in which he lives because they reject his religious visions, which are rejecting of their religion. He does manage to get some followers, but as a result, assassins are sent against him. He has to go into exile. They are poor and destitute. Eventually, he becomes a leader of a large following, which is able to conquer the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula. So it's not that it's not mentioned in this book, but he does actually triumph in the end and gain much greater power. But they do actually say in this book that even when he is in power, even when he, as the prophet of God, is conquering the whole, the land, the Arabian Peninsula, even then he's living simply and he's a very humble person, etc., etc. Now, as far as I can tell, this claim is basically accepted by Muslim and non-Muslim scholars alike. That basically we're pretty sure that Muhammad himself truly believed the things he was saying, that he was genuine in that he wasn't making this stuff up, that he wasn't doing it for gain, or unlike what many people think about Joseph Smith of the Mormon tradition, that he was most likely a con man and was probably doing a lot of this for gain. And maybe didn't believe, possibly, I don't know, didn't believe any of it. Most people agree, as far as I can tell, even the non-Muslim scholars agree, that Muhammad was genuine in his belief that he was a prophet of God, and that he was here, he was being visited by angels, and that God was revealing this stuff to him, and that he was suffered and persecuted for his beliefs. Now, I've got no problem with that, but the fact that somebody is persecuted for their beliefs does not make it any more likely to be true. Well, possibly it makes it more likely. It doesn't make it very likely. There are a number of people who have been persecuted for their beliefs over history. Lots and lots of Christians have been persecuted for their beliefs. But not only that, I'm sure I'd be surprised if you could find any religion that hadn't been persecuted for their beliefs. I mean, if you think of the Buddhists being persecuted in Tibet, if you think about the religious type violence that you see all the way around the world, there are a lot of religious people who suffer for their beliefs and don't gain material wealth or leadership or power as a result of earnestly believing their religions. That doesn't make them isn't convincing evidence that they're true. They can't all be true, and yet almost all religions would have these people in them. And so the fact that Muhammad was earnest in his belief is hardly compelling evidence. To give you one possible explanation about how somebody can be earnest and fervent in their beliefs and be utterly wrong, we only have to look at some forms of mental illness. And I don't mean that he was a crazy madman wandering around the Middle East, although I guess that's possible. But we know that something we would call schizophrenia these days, of a relatively mild type, people could experience hallucinations, people can experience visions, and depending how they interpret them, they can be perfectly functioning in other areas of their life. And this could be what happened. That way he could be completely earnest in his belief and still completely wrong. And that's not a consideration in this book. This book has done nothing to prove that, to show that they haven't even taken into account that possibility. They've just gone, well, because he was sincere, he must have been right. And that, I think, is a leap too far, especially when what you're leaping to is, if he is right, so much unlikely stuff comes from that. Suddenly we have this book that is the divine word of God, and yet seems to be wrong on all sorts of things, and doesn't seem particularly different from any other book that we've seen. Okay, last section, section 7, the phenomenal growth of Islam. And in this section they point out I assume this book is old, because they're using quite old quotes from the most recent one is 96, basically showing that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. And this is true. The fastest growing religions in the world seem to be things like Islam and Christianity, and mainly because of the large population growth experienced in the developing world, and with the developing world, lots of people are converting from traditional type religions to these large monotheistic world religions that are doing extensive proselytizing in these developing world. Interestingly, in other countries that's not true. Here in Australia, for example, the fastest growing religious affiliation is none. More people are becoming atheists than anything else, and especially if you look over the last 100 years, the growth in actually worldwide, over the last 10 years, the fastest growing religious group is Muslims. Over the last 100 years, far and away the fastest growing group, by a factor of twice as fast as any other group, is atheists. And this is possibly, I don't know if it's the worst argument, I can't see how this could possibly be convincing. Unless everybody was converting to Islam. Unless that was the case, and even then I don't think it would be particularly convincing, but at least that would say something. If the evidence for Islam was so staggeringly good, yes, I would expect everybody to convert to it, but then I would expect you to give me the evidence and I'd convert too. The fact that a lot of people are converting to Islam, but the same rate, basically the same rate people are converting to Christianity, and at similar rates in some countries people are leaving religions, to me suggests that you can't really divine truth, i.e. whether a religion is true, simply from the number of followers they have or how fast people are converting to or from it. And that's basically it. That is the last section. That is, according to this book, I assume their best evidence for the truth of Islam. So in the last video we had scientific proof, the scientific miracles, and I went through all those, and most of those were particularly underwhelming, and the ones that weren't underwhelming were flat out wrong. This video we've looked at the challenge to produce some writing that is as good as the Quran, and I would contend that Shakespeare's writing was at least as good as the Quranic writing, probably better. We have the biblical prophecies predicting Muhammad, and as we saw, nobody agrees on those, but even if they did, the fact that you can fulfill a prophecy that you already knew about is not particularly compelling. If the next section we have is the verses in the Quran, the prophecies in the Quran, of which they only present one, and I think this falls into the same category as lots of other religious ones, is that most of them aren't particularly impressive because they're not very specific. Some of them could easily have been written after the event they were supposed to predict. Section 5 we had miracles performed by the Prophet Muhammad, which are documented only within the Quran. Again, hardly compelling that the Quran says he does miracles and therefore we need to believe the Quran. Number 6 was the life of Muhammad, which proved that he was earnest in his belief, and I accept that, but that doesn't convince me that the Quran is true. And lastly was the growth of Islam. And again, the growth of Islam tells you nothing about whether it's true or not, otherwise the growth of atheism would tell you that atheism is true. As I said in the previous video, Chapter 2 is about the benefits of being a Muslim, and Chapter 3 is general information on Islam. I'm not particularly interested in those. Chapter 3 contains a whole bunch of information about Islam. Most of it's pretty well spot on. It does leave out some of the nastier stuff which lots of Muslims believe and practice, but other than that, it's actually fairly straightforward. If you're interested in Islam and you don't know a lot about some of the tenets of its faith, I would recommend reading it, but I'm not going to do a review of it because to a skeptical non-Muslim it's not particularly interesting. And there you have it. That's the book. Brief Illustrated Guide to Understanding Islam. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.